Hey everyone, welcome back to Corporate Decoder, the place where we break down all the nitty-gritty of SEC filings. And today we have a real doozy, a consolidated SSR output from Edgar, a filing from Vanguard fixed income securities funds. So what is the big story here? Well, it looks like everyone. As favorite fund giant Vanguard is giving us a peek under the hood of some of their fixed income funds for the period ending the 31st of July 2025. We read talking about performance costs and where all the money is actually invested. Stick around as we decode this report to see if these funds are making smart moves or just treading water. And hey, if you love getting these straightforward breakdowns of what these financial documents actually mean for companies and your investments, make sure you subscribe. We also have a Discord community linked in the description below if you want to chat more about this filing and others. Let us dive into it, starting with the registrant information. We got Vanguard Fixed Income Securities, funds registered with an Investment Company Act file number of 811-02368. Their fiscal year ends the 31st of January, and this report covers the period from the 1st of February 2025, right up until the 31st of July 2025. Now let's get to the juicy part, the actual reports for each fund. We'll start with the Vanguard Short-Term Treasury Fund investor shares with the ticker VFIS. For the last 6 months on a hypothetical $10,000 investment, the cost for investor shares came in at a neat $10, a tiny 0.20% of the investment. It is important to note that this is annualized. As of the 31st of July 2025, the fund had a hefty $5, 850 million in net assets and held 206 portfolio positions. Here is where the money was going around. 81.7% was in US government securities and 11.5% in conventional mortgage-backed securities. It also shows a negative 2.0% in conventional mortgage-backed securities liability for sale commitments, which sounds a bit like they are on the hook for something. Now let S jump over to the Vanguard Short-Term Treasury Fund Admiral shares with the ticker VFX. Interestingly, the fund net assets are the same $5, 850 million with 206 portfolio holdings. But here is where it gets interesting for Admiral shares. The cost for a hypothetical $10,000 investment drops to just $5, that is 0.10% annualized. Lower costs usually mean more money in investors' pockets. The portfolio turnover rate for both investor and Admiral shares was 139%. This means they bought and sold assets amounting to 139% of their portfolio value in the period. A high turnover rate can sometimes mean more transaction costs, but also potentially more flexibility in adjusting to market changes. Now let us sprint through some other funds. The Vanguard High Yield Corporate Fund Investor shares ticker VETWX saw costs of $11 on a $10,000 investment, a bit higher at 0.22%. Its net assets were $24, 995 million with a whopping 1,004 holdings and a much lower portfolio turnover rate of 24%. Mostly invested in various corporate sectors like communications at 13.1% and consumer discretionary at 15.3%. The Admiral shares ticker VUBLEAKS for the same fund had costs of just $6 or 0.12%. This mirrors the trend we saw with the Treasury Fund's lower cost for Admiral shares. The portfolio turnover rate is identical at 24%. This consistency across share classes is a good sign of a well-managed fund. Moving along to the Vanguard Intermediate Term Investment. Grade fund investor shares with ticker VFX. Costs were $10 or 0.20%. Net assets were $36, 637 million, and holdings were at 1,740. Portfolio turnover was modest at 33%. Here the financial sector represented the largest chunk at 31.2%. And the Admiral shares VFX for this fund also saw lower costs at $5 or 0.09%. Consistent also with the Treasury funds, the Vanguard Long-Term Treasury Fund. Investor shares with ticker VUSDEX had costs of $10 or 0.20%. Net assets were smaller at $2, 905 million with 156 holdings, but a very high portfolio turnover rate of 154%. This suggests a lot of buying and selling happening there, mostly invested in US government securities at 85.1%. The Admiral shares VUSDEX for this fund also mirrors the cost structure with $5 or 0.10%. Now for the Vanguard Short-Term Federal Fund Investor shares VSGBX, costs were $10 or 0.20%. Net assets were $4, 368 million with 457 holdings and a very high portfolio turnover rate of 232%, diversified across agency bonds and notes at 22.2% conventional mortgage, backed securities at 37.1% and US government securities at 22.7%. The Admiral shares versus GDX for this fund also shows $5 or 0.10% for cost. Consistent again on the cost front, the Vanguard short-term investment. Grade fund investor shares VFSDX reported $10 costs or 0.20%. Net assets were a massive $52,754 million with 2152 holdings and a portfolio turnover rate of 46%. A broad diversification here with financials at 30% and other at 19.7% being the largest segments. The Admiral shares VFS SOC shows $5 or 0.09% cost, a lower cost for Admiral shares. It also has 2152 holdings and the same 46% turnover rate. Finally, the Vanguard Ultra Short-Term Bond Fund investor shares VUBBEX had costs of $10 or 0.20%. Net assets tallied $14, 600 million with 872 holdings and a 45% turnover rate. Investments here were heavily weighted towards corporate bonds at 61.4%. Admiral shares VUSVEX shows $5 cost or 0.09%. Now let's look at the actual financial statements for the short-term treasury fund. It is noted that the fund files its complete schedule of portfolio holdings with the Securities and Exchange Commission SEC as an exhibit to its reports on Form N-Port. These reports are available on the SECURITIES website at www.cc.gov. The schedule of investments as of the 31st of July 2025 shows a massive amount invested in US government securities, totaling $4,777,823. Agency bonds and notes are next at $88,313,000, and then conventional mortgage, backed securities at $672,241,000. These are all US Treasury notes and bonds with various coupon rates and maturity dates spanning from August 2026 to January 2029. The face amounts range from $78,817,000 to $28,858,000, and market values generally track these face amounts closely. On the agency bonds and notes side, we see Resolution Funding Corp. Principal strips maturing in 2030 face amounts range from $71,700,000 to $35,000. Then there are conventional mortgage backed securities listed as Fannie Mae pools and Freddie Mac pools with coupon rates varying and maturity dates stretching out to 2033 and 2032 respectively. The fund also holds Vanguard Market Liquidity Fund representing 0.1% of net assets with a face amount and market value of $6,091,000. There are also options purchased and to be announced TBA transactions listed. Notably, these are all valued at level 2, meaning other significant observable inputs are used other than quoted prices in active markets. The statement of assets and liabilities shows total investments in securities valued at $5,605,345,000. Total assets are $6,198,160,000, with liabilities around $348,452,000. Net assets stand at a very healthy $5,849,708,000. Investor shares have net assets of $469,876,000 corresponding to 4761. 5898 shares outstanding with a net asset value per S-share of $9.87. Similarly, Admiral shares have net assets of $5,379,832,000 across 54,517,7394 shares, also at $9.87 per S-share. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 shows investment income primarily from interest totaling $123,833,000. Expenses are much lower, totaling $3,129,000. Net investment income is $120,704,000. Realized net gains are $5,743,000, while unrealized appreciation stands at $19,954,000. The net result is a $145,793,000 increase in net assets from operations. Looking at the statement of changes in net assets for investor shares, there was a net decrease of $3,302,000 from capital share transactions, reducing overall net assets. Admiral shares, on the other hand, saw a net decrease as well of $6,640,000. Overall total increase in net assets is $15,123,000. For investor shares, the net asset value per S-share began at $9.82 and ended at $9.87. Total return was 2.53%. For Admiral shares, the net asset value per S-share also started at $9.82 and ended at $9.87, meaning a total return of 2.51%. 0.58%. The expense ratio for both share classes is exceptionally low at 0.20%. The short-term federal fund schedule of investments shows a similar structure with US government securities at $990,956,000, followed by agency bonds and notes at $970,371,000 and conventional mortgage. Backed securities at $1,620,036,000. These US Treasury notes and bonds have coupon rates like 3.625% with maturity dates in 2026 and 2028 and face amounts in the hundreds of thousands. Agency bonds include Federal Home Loan Banks and various Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae issues. There are also UMS pools mentioned with coupon rates from 1.500% to 2.500%. The fund also holds a significant amount in temporary cash investments, represented by Vanguard Market Liquidity Fund, totaling $522,762,000. The short-term federal fund carries a liability for sale commitments valued at $159,062,000. Notably, this is a negative percentage of net assets. Total liabilities are $597,584,000 and net assets are $4,368,301,000. Investor shares have a net asset value per S-share of $10.26 and Admiral shares also at $10.26. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 shows investment income of $85,124, $1,000 primarily from interest. Total expenses are significantly lower at $2,340, $1,000, leading to a net investment income of $82,784, $1,000. Realized net gains are negative $11,904, $1,000, while change in unrealized appreciation is positive $51,547, $1,000. Net result is a solid $120,418, $1,000, increase in net assets from operations. For investor shares, net assets are $364 million, and for Admiral shares, it is $4.004 million. The expense ratio is remarkably low at 0.10% for Admiral shares and 0.20% for investor shares. The intermediate term Treasury fund schedule of investments shows a dominant holding in US government securities at 82.6% and agency bonds and notes at 5.6%. These Treasury notes and bonds have coupon rates from 1.125% to 5.25%. 0% with maturity dates generally in the late 2020s and early 2030s, and face amounts in the hundreds of thousands. Conventional mortgage-backed securities make up 2.8% and non-conventional mortgage-backed securities 2.9%. Notably, there is a negative 2.0% in conventional mortgage-backed securities liability for sale commitments. Total investments are $6,703,404, $1,000. This liability for sale commitments shows a negative value totaling $137,025, $1,000. Net assets are a massive $7,013,438, $1,000. Investor shares have a net asset value per S-share of $9.92 and Admiral shares also at $9.92. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 displays investment income of $144,700, $1,000. Expenses are $3,700, $1,000, leaving a hearty net investment income of $141,000, $1,000. Realized net losses are minimal at $81, $1,000, but change in unrealized appreciation is substantial at $117,138, $1,000. This results in a significant increase in net assets of $259,054, $1,000. For investor shares, the net asset value began at $9.75 and ended at $9.92. The Admiral shares also saw a similar increase. The total return for investor shares was 3.77%. The long-term Treasury fund schedule of investments paints a picture of heavy investment in US government securities at 85.1%, followed by agency bonds and notes at 22.2%. Scroll United States Treasury note to bond title. These Treasury notes and bonds mature much later, generally in the 2040s and 2050s. Face amounts are often in the tens of thousands. Conventional mortgage-backed securities are at 5.6%. There is also a negative figure for conventional mortgage-backed securities liability for sale commitments at negative 3.7%. Total investments are $2,841,539, $1,000. This liability for sale commitments is again a negative number totaling $159,062, $1,000. This seems to indicate a significant potential outflow. Net assets are $2,904,710,000. Investor shares have a NAV per S share of $7.87, which is identical to the Admiral shares, indicating a consistent performance across share classes. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 shows interest income of $64,550,000, but a massive realized net loss of $195,888,000. However, this is offset by a very strong unrealized appreciation of $182,586,000. The net result is an increase in net assets of $5,374,000. Investor shares have net assets of $527 million, while Admiral shares sit at $2,378 million. The total return for investor shares was a modest 1.75%. Now let us shift gears to the corporate bond funds. The short-term investment grade fund schedule of investments shows us government securities at 9.9%. This is a much smaller allocation compared to the Treasury funds. These Treasury notes and bonds have coupon rates like 4.125% to 4.625%, with maturity dates around 2026 to 2030. The most striking figure here is the negative 2.0% conventional mortgage-backed securities liability for sale commitments. This suggests a significant exposure or potential obligation. Total investments are a colossal $52,584,019. Liabilities are substantial, with payables for investment securities purchased at $460,509,000. Net assets are $52,754,068,000. Investor shares have a NAV per S share of $10.44. Admiral shares also at $10.44. Even more impressive institutional shares are at $10.44 per S share as well. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 highlights a huge net investment income of $1,202,595,000. However, there are realized net losses of $111,130,000, but the change in unrealized appreciation is remarkable at $681,351,000. Overall, a staggering increase in net assets of $1,772,816,000. Investor shares net assets are $3. 0.25 million Admiral shares are $37. 431 million and institutional shares are a massive $12. 298 million. Expense ratios are incredibly low across the board. Investor shares have a 0.20% expense ratio, and Admiral shares even lower at 0.10%. Turnover rates are also quite reasonable. The intermediate term investment grade fund shows us government securities at 8.4% and agency bonds and notes at 5.6%. The face amounts of these treasury notes and bonds are typically in the tens or hundreds of thousands. Conventional mortgage-backed securities are at 2.8%. Again, we see a negative figure for conventional mortgage-backed securities liability for sale commitments at negative 2.0%. Total investments are $6,703,404,000. This liability for sale commitments is a negative $137,025,000. Net assets are $7,038,000, $438,000. Investor shares NAV is $9.92 and Admiral shares NAV is also $9.92. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 shows investment income of $144,700,000. Expenses are $3,700,000, resulting in a net investment income of $141,000. Realized net loss is minimal at $81,000, but it is dwarfed by an unrealized appreciation of $117,135,000. This leads to a significant increase in net assets of $259,054,000. Investor shares NAV started at $9.75 and ended at $9.92. For Admiral shares, the NAV also saw a similar increase and the total return for investor shares was 3.77%. Finally, we look at the long-term Treasury fund schedule of investments with an overwhelming 85.1% in US government securities. Agency bonds and notes are at 4.6%. These are very long-term notes and bonds with coupon rates ranging from 0.00% to 7.000% and maturities stretching to 2055 and beyond. The face amounts are substantial. Conventional mortgage, Backed securities are listed at 5.6%. We also see that negative figure again for conventional mortgage, backed securities liability for sale commitments at negative 3.7%. Total investments are $2,841,539. This liability for sale commitments really stands out at negative $108,329. Thousand net assets are $2,904,710. Investor shares and Admiral shares NAV per S share are both $7.87. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 shows interest income of $64,550,000. However, a large realized net loss of $195,888,000 is reported. This is significantly offset by an unrealized appreciation of $186,403,000. The net result is an increase in net assets of $53,374,000. Investor shares have net assets of $527 million, while Admiral shares hold $2, $378 million. The total return for investor shares was 1.75%. Let's briefly look at the short-term investment grade fund. US government securities make up 94.7% of the portfolio, which makes sense for a short-term fund. Interestingly, we see that negative liability again for conventional mortgage, backed securities at minus 2.0%. Total investments are $52,584,019. Net assets are $52,754,068,000. Investor shares are at $10.44, per S share Admiral shares at $10.44, and even institutional shares are at $10.44. The statement of operations for the 6 months ended the 31st of July 2025 shows stellar investment income of $1,227,000 and $63,000. After expenses of $24,468,000, we have a net investment income of $1,202,595,000. Realized net losses are $111,000, $130,000, but a huge unrealized appreciation of $694,308,000 blows that away, resulting in a massive increase in net assets of $1,772,816,000. Investor shares net assets are $3, 0.25 million Admiral shares are $37, 431 million, and institutional shares are $12, 298 million. And what might be the story here with these Vanguard funds? Well, they are clearly focused on the US Treasury and agency debt for the Treasury funds, meaning safety. The higher turnover in some of these funds suggests active management likely trying to capture short-term movements. For the investment grade funds, they are holding a lot of corporate debt, and there is that recurring negative percentage in mortgage. Backed securities liability for sale commitments, which warrants a closer look. If you are looking for safety and low cost for your fixed income exposure, these Vanguard funds seem to offer that. The expense ratios are consistently low. However, some of the high yield and ultra short-term funds show very high portfolio turnover rates, which can mean more aggressive trading. The inclusion of derivatives like futures, contracts, and swaps across many of these funds signifies an attempt to gain exposure or hedge risk more efficiently, but it also introduces complexity and potential volatility, which is to be expected for funds that venture beyond the safest US Treasuries. Overall, Vanguard continues its streak of offering low-cost funds, while the Treasury and investment-grade funds point towards conservative strategies, the high yield and ultra. Short-term funds suggest a more active approach to managing risk and potential return. The negative percentages related to mortgage-backed securities liabilities are a bit of a head scratcher and would definitely warrant further investigation if you are a potential investor. Alright, that is our breakdown of this Vanguard filing. What are your thoughts on these numbers and what they signal for the company SECURITIES? Drop your insights in the comments below. If this analysis was valuable, hitting that like button really helps, and subscribe for more corporate deep dives. Thanks for watching, see you next time.